Sim Shalom Tova Uvracha Chen Vachesed.
Welcome. Archie Rand was born in Brooklyn in 1949. His first public exhibit of his paintings when he was 17 years old. Since then, he's never stopped exhibiting. He's had a long and distinguished career as a painter and as an artist of stained glass works. And he is part of a wonderful show at Spertus Museum of 24 Jewish artists dealing with Jewish themes. And Archie's here with us today to talk about his evolution, not only as a secular artist, but as a Jewish artist. Welcome to the show. Archie, when did you first begin to see yourself as a Jewish artist?
It was more something that I fought for a while, because I thought when I was much younger that the idea of being an artist and being a Jewish artist was somehow mutually exclusive, or for that matter, just being Jewish. And at the same time, my Jewish upbringing was strong. I had my kids in Yeshiva Flatbush in Brooklyn. And all the while that I was showing work in secular galleries, I would do these little, fairly insignificant things that would denote paintings as being Jewish. I did a series of paintings from 68 to 71 where I did nothing but letters on them, you know, and words and sentences. And I figured, well, that was a tribute to literacy and the beauty of letters as denoted in the Kabbalah. But I never really came out and said it. And then I started putting images in the same way, making them sort of poetic synapses. Then in '74, I was naming all the pictures in a New York show after the martyrs of the Yom Kippur service, the martyred rabbis. Mm-hmm. It seemed like good titles, and I was drawn to it, and at the same time really didn't know, A, if I wanted to, because there was a certain amount of dislocation with the art community you would make yourself subject to if you came right out and said, I want to be Chaim Gross, you know. And
would they take you less serious if
sure.
you declared yourself
Sure.
as a Jewish artist?
Yeah, at that time, definitely.
You'd be taken less seriously.
Yeah, and what happened was in 1974 that happened. I was presented by a marvelous man named David Schwartz, who was the administrator of the Flatbush Yeshiva, with a commission to mural 8,000 feet of space in an Orthodox synagogue. And I said, well, this is it. Once I start this, you know, I will be excommunicado from the art community. And that's almost what happened, with the exception, strangely enough, of some of the older painters to whom I will always be grateful. Most of them Jewish, in fact. People like Jules Zalitsky and Stanley Boxer, who were color field painters at the time, were very supportive. And the younger painters were vicious. They,
now, where did the viciousness came from? What, that you'd knock yourself out of the serious arena of painting if you undertook this commission?
Yes, at that time, serious painting was basically if you could make one color over 20 feet. And the less you put in, the more you bled yourself with a razor blade, the more pure you were, and the less that your pictures stunk of any kind of humanity. You know, you were an aesthetic presentation. That wasn't all clear to me at the time. I knew I wanted to be aesthetically pleasing, and doing whatever Jewish art meant, I had no idea at the time. You know.
Well, when the administrator came to you with this request to take on this commission,
Yes.
8,000 square feet, did you consider turning it down?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
what made you decide to go ahead?
I thought that would be a cowardly thing to do. I thought this was a fantastic opportunity to actually put my brush where my mouth was, so to speak, in a sense. I had been naming these pictures and kidding around with the idea of being Jewish, but being a liberal New York intellectual, so you could have your Jewishness and eat it too, or whatever, I don't know. And I figured, well, this is it. You know, at a very early age, I had the chance for the stuff to hit the fan, as they say.
Now, you were 24 at that time?
24.
I understand the first thing you did was go and study at the yeshiva for several
It wasn't
months.
the first thing I did. The first thing I did was I handed in a sketch for approval. And I did a very elaborate sketch. It was a Syrian synagogue, a Syrian Jewish community. And I figured I would make it look like Oriental rugs and things. And I put a big menorah in the middle. And then I did a rather complex and Kabbalistically oriented Magen David. And I figured, well, I'll do a menorah and a Jewish star, I'll grab the money and I'll run. I thought I'd be out of there in 6 months. And what happened was that there were 38 panels to be filled. And I put up the menorah, and I put up the Magen David, and I came out really terrific, and the congregation was very pleased. And then they said, now what'll you do? And I said, and I had no idea. And I realized that very much the way Cézanne would look at an apple until it fell apart and really look at it so he knew his subject matter. I knew nothing about my subject matter. And I said, you can't do that. You just have to stop and find out what this is about. And it's at that point that I started putting about 8 hours a day into yeshiva study. My parents at that time had recently moved to an area near Lakewood, New Jersey. And there's a very large yeshiva down there, which some friends of mine had been admitted to. And I went down there and they were very helpful. I just started to study, or learn as they call it.
One thing you had to deal with was this fundamental struggle of the second commandment, saying that you shall make no graven images. So how did you resolve this for yourself?
Well, we're very fortunate in this century as Jewish artists to have had the uncovering in, I believe it was 1932, of the Dura Europos murals near Damascus. And to briefly fill you in on that, I don't know if you're familiar with them or not. The city of Dura Europos was a very active trading city along the, I guess it was the Silk Route. And it was a walled city, and within the wall of the city was a completely frescoed synagogue from floor to ceiling that had been, the wall of the city had been caved in during some military campaign. And in 1932, archaeologists, I believe it's 1932, don't hold me to it,
Okay.
Uncovered this completely intact Talmud-era synagogue that has some of the most horrifying and amazing art in the history of the world, as far as I'm concerned. It's unbelievable stuff. And it's pictures of Moses hitting the rock and the water coming out, and pictures of the hand of God lifting bodies out of the valley of dry bones, Ezekiel's vision. I mean, and when you have a Orthodox, synagogue within 150 years of the destruction of the temple, having paintings on the wall, not only paintings, but figurative paintings depicting not only biblical characters, but the very hand of God, you realize that someplace along the line, the commandment has somehow been misinterpreted. And at that point, I figured, although I didn't have the reasons and the knowledge to go against it, I had the precedent. And what eventually happened was that the case was taken to a religious court. And I was found kosher.
Kosher, you mean so that you could go ahead and do these 38 murals and those images that you had in mind?
Yes, there were some prescriptions, and the faithful, among which I number myself, believed that because I hadn't transgressed any of them up till that point, it was somehow meant to be. Certain things like any animals that I had portrayed had to be over 6 feet from the floor, so that when you looked at them, you didn't bow your eyes down as if they were deities. And I had done that instinctively.
That goes back to the years of 74, 77, speaking of the synagogue in Brooklyn, B'nai Yosef.
B'nai Yosef, yeah.
Yosef. Now you are seated in front of some of your most current works, or at least recent works. How did your style evolve to this?
Good question. After 1977, when I finished the commission, I had started out being more or less a color field painter, which was the dominant style. Young painters usually paint in the dominant style. My brand of color field painting had always been quasi-figurative. I always had these kind of Jackson Pollock-y figures running through them. So I was predisposed towards not making a flat, intellectually homogeneous field, but I really had no way out. When I finished the murals, I couldn't go back to doing that anymore. I had been painting so much figurative work, so much real space, as they say, that I found myself a fish out of water. I didn't know any painters working that way, but that's what I had to do. So I started painting these fields and throwing lines on top of them that became figures and objects and things, and then I found I had to somehow manifest these things with some kind of meaning or faith. They just couldn't be things in the tradition of art that I'd already seen. And I realized that what I'd spent the most time invested in was, this is over a very long period of time, of course. Not very long, I'm not that old, but it was over a couple of years, that more and more it became apparent that my spiritual background was necessarily the subject matter I had to draw from. And it becomes clearer and clearer to me that my beliefs and my art, in order to be something of any value to anybody, will have to become one at some point. And these pictures here are just steps towards that development.
You know, it's so interesting to hear the artists speak of the spiritual content of their work. Tell us about the spiritual, the religious content of these works, please. The
Rabbi with the lamb and the Torah and the menorah are attempts to get rid of the stigma of that kind of Manny Katz Hasidic, you know, the Jewish Quarter of Jerusalem, $5 original Jewish art syndrome. I wanted to actually confront that and see, well, what does it feel like just to paint that?
Okay.
And paint it with the kind of love and faith and seriousness that I can bring to bear on that. And that sort of exorcised that from that fear of looking like that. I said to myself, so what if you look like that? That would be great. Do a lot more. The picture in the middle is the Ark of the Dura Europos Synagogue, which is a kind of like a household mascot of mine. I think about it and look at the reproductions of that often, and they're very inspiring. And that's just a little homage to the altar in the Dura Europos. And the fellows at the end are rabbis, and they're not painted with the sort of saintliness necessarily that this fellow is painted with here, but that's the very point, is that their very learning makes them, in my eyes, a certain sainted group, even though on this earth, where they're forced to reside until they pass over into the afterlife, they take on all sorts of funny forms. They're the kinds of forms that can be misread by people looking only at the tangible signs of this earth. That is, they look like a bunch of slobs. You know, they're guys standing around with cigars, and they're blustery. Some of them are very, very pious and self-righteous. They're all wonderful. I love them dearly. And these are the rabbis. These are the people I will have to come to terms with if I'm going to continue working this way. So I asked these people for permission by putting them up there. And they said, go ahead, and that's what they're doing there.
You refer to them as humbling images.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, you realize that these are men of tremendous, tremendous, tremendous learning and saintliness.
Yes.
And they don't look that way. You know, you realize that no matter how serious your goals are, the very seriousness of those goals make them an obstacle to their completion in a way. That is, you have to actually do it on this earth. And you realize that very few artists that I know, despite the current myth of artists being, I mean, yes, all artists are hardworking, wonderful people, and they're all severely serious and dedicated to their craft.
Yeah.
But from what I've seen in the yeshivas, not many of them are half as dedicated as men of religion. They really don't have that calling. There's something else drawing many artists to the field, which doesn't draw people to religion as far as I can see. There's something in lines of a secular payoff in this world that artists somehow think they're entitled to, that men of religion, unless they're Oral Roberts or something, never expect. They invest all their energy into living a thoroughly spiritual life, somehow in a sense to almost make amends for the fact that they're born almost incapable of fulfilling the promise that God has endowed us with at birth, you know. And so they're humbling, all right. Yeah.
Actually, these paintings are part of a show with 23 other artists, all of them dealing with Jewish themes. What are some of the themes that you see in this show?
Well, there's a few. I think that the significant thing about a show like this, I'm going to answer your question in a roundabout way because I have to divide down into a couple of categories, is that it exists at all. I sort of make the reference to the fact that 50 years after emancipation, black musicians were able to homogenize a bunch of very diverse influences and make this incredible cultural creation called jazz. Somehow I feel that Jewish art, a loose term, is sort of at that brink. It's at the form of coagulating itself. It's embryonic. Somehow I can feel it. There are fewer and fewer obstacles and restrictions. The void and vacuum is great enough for its strength to rush in and fill that place. And I find that it coincidentally is 50 years after the Holocaust, approximately. And maybe it takes that long for something like that to develop. I find that some of the themes of this show are either frustration with accommodating assimilation, where you have many elements sort of forced against their will, or for that matter, Audrey Flack's work, where there is a very conscious attempt, in fact, to bring in many, many diverse elements.
Yes.
And homogenize them simply with the force of Jewish will, which is something that 2,000 years of being, of the external imposition of the wandering Jew syndrome has made us very adept at. So in a certain sense, that's a language. And then there's another language, which is the certainty, the haven of the Orthodox, which is when Maimonides will say something like, in certain matters, Aristotle is absolutely correct. That sort of certainty is something that, again, post-Holocaust Jews might no longer feel ashamed to make visible in the world. So then you have everything from very quiet and restrained images, like Toby Kahn's, for instance, or Sue Miller's. It's just because I'm sitting in this room with this work here that I can make reference to it. I'm not slighting any of the other artists in the show. That this personal and very fragile vision of the Jew, almost for the first time in a very long time, being allowed to peer out of this rubble and take what's uniquely and Jewishly theirs and present it. That kind of certainty is being made more apparent in this other kind of work. And in work such as my own, there's a little of everything being thrown in. I'm trying to make, that kind of obvious and proud statement, but the language I'm using is the assimilationist language. I'm not particularly happy with either of those two solutions in my own work, but that just means I'm alive.
And developing.
And developing, yeah.
Why are artists now able to incorporate more spiritual content? Why do they feel the need to do this as Jews?
It's sort of serendipitous in a way. What happened was that, as far as I can see, in the 40s, the artist in America was in such desperate and ignominious straits. It got to the point where Adolf Gottlieb said, the reason we could do what we did is because nobody cared, nobody was watching us. And a group of artists, a significant number of whom were Jewish, forged the abstract expressionist ethic, which was a very singular and vital statement. And reactions to that from succeeding generations recognized that there had to be spiritual strength in order for this statement to have come about. And they being the next generation of artists and the next generation being the heirs to this commercial success, which was attendant on the demise of the abstract expressionists, didn't really have the courage to reinstigate a powerful, possibly asocial message into their work. So it became more and more and more broken down in a series of questions and answers and intellectual responses.
In a sense, you're saying they were afraid to be too religious.
They were afraid to make a statement, basically, of any kind. That is, the non-Jews who became adept at marketing their work or became publicly recognized found that a lot of assimilationist Jewish critics were supporting work that really didn't say anything. And that was good. That was seen as being equal, platonic in a way.
And that seems to be what's changed. I think that's what's clear about in this show, certainly.
Yeah, well, this show is a symptom of artists who had been on the outs either by their age or either being too old or by their youth as being people that don't care, being able to make that statement of faith a Jewish one.
Clearly.
So this is what I believe.
Okay. Thank you, Archie Rand, for being here today, for speaking so eloquently about your beautiful paintings. Thank you. Next, we're going to be talking to Maury Fred, who is the director of the Spertus Museum, and will tell us about this exhibit and about the plans that Spertus has in the future in terms of Jewish art. Hi, I'm speaking with Maury Fred, who is the director of the Spertus Museum. Maury, why is the Themes 2 show such an important one for the museum?
I think it's an important show because of what it represents, not only for the show itself, but also in terms of future directions for Spertus. In the first place, you have 24 artists, all of whom are established, well-established artists within the United States that are making statements of a variety of statements that reveal aspects of experiences that they feel as Jews. Mm-hmm. One of the artists, as a matter of fact, is not a Jew, but one who was very much touched by a visit to Auschwitz and therefore reflected as a non-Jew on what this experience, specifically Jewish experience, but not merely Jewish experience, had to do with the entire universal mankind. We find in these artworks, again, a fine show, a variety of artists, a variety of styles, an embryo of an attempt by good artists to begin to express Jewish themes, religious, sociological, literary, and can begin us here at Spertus in talking and thinking about what is the purpose of art in the wider context of Jewish education. This is why I think this show is extremely important, to begin to look at art in a holistic fashion. As a cultural anthropologist, I must do this and see this more so rather than at the margin of a culture, art in all of its ramifications as a core component in the transmission in culture, and what we can learn from this art, how we can utilize art in the artistic format to teach and to edify our own experiences and our own knowledge and our own cultural development. This is why it is an important aspect.
What can be learned? Now, these artists deal with themes of the Holocaust, biblical themes. What is the viewer to learn from this experience?
Each artist, and this is a part of the show, has a personal statement in which he or she describes what motivated him or her to paint this particular subject matter. I think that as I go through this show, and it is just each time that I do go through the show, I am beginning to reflect more and more on the subject matter. As it is with any art, you go deeper and deeper. We have, for example, a photorealistic art of well-known artist Audrey Flack. Something popular, the painting behind me here.
Yes.
Very popular in the 70s, the particular style, but what is important about this is one of the first attempts, as I understand, to really deal artistically with something that was so incomprehensible as the Holocaust. And because we're in the embryonic stage of thinking about directions for Jewish art, what is Jewish art, how are we to evaluate Jewish art, we must look at this show as a process, or as a part of a process in which these statements are being made, but they will build on one another, and the show itself becomes a totality. Each show is like a bloom in itself. Taken together, it's like an orchard forever growing, forever providing an aspect of what is this experience and what does it mean to us.
Now, that's why you have created space for a new gallery here.
That's right. We're extremely excited. We will be inaugurating in October of '87 the new Anfield Gallery for Contemporary Art. And that's why we see this show as a beginning. This is beginning a long-term dialectic discussion on what is Jewish art, how it fits into the wider range of Jewish culture and transmission of values and ethics to our children and to ourselves. We will be opening this gallery in October of '87 and be asking for the artistic community in Chicago, in the Midwest primarily, but we'll go beyond that to participate.
Maury, this new gallery will focus a lot of attention on Jewish art and Jewish artists. Why has it taken so long, really, for Jews to recognize the visual component of the cultural experience?
This is a very complex question to answer. Much of it has to do, perhaps originally, with the issue raised about graven images, the ability to express on canvas or through other art forms. We're a very literary people, a people of the book. We think primarily, when you begin to think of a Jewish museum, museums that grew out of libraries initially, books, and then the artifacts, the religious artifacts, Chanukiot, Magen David, all of these very basic symbols in Judaism. I think one of the most interesting things is if you begin to look at Jewish organizations as they struggle for logo, anyone who's worked for an organization struggling for this logo finds that we have limited accepted symbols. And the problem is to break away from this, to begin to think that we can go beyond this, that when we're looking at these artists and their works, their expressions, their personal expressions from experience, many of them abstract, others not so abstract, but trying to discover new symbols, this is a part, I think, of a cultural experience. In other words, these artists not only teach and edify, but they represent what is going on in the minds and souls of the contemporary Jew. And this is why it's important. It is that dialectic between, obviously, the artist, his work, and the viewer, and how it begins to build. As many of these artists begin, perhaps they began in secular art, not thinking about Jewish themes. At some point in their lives, they began to think of experiences which they began to realize were very specifically tied to their experiences as Jews. And so that you have an entire expression of an age that, again, once we begin to view it in this way, we can see it going over a long period of time and will become archivally fascinating for us to look at our experience as Jews in America and Jews in the world through the art and the expression of these artists.
Do you anticipate a resistance to this from any part of?
That is interesting, because I think that for a long time, from discussions with a variety of people, there has been a fear about this art might be provocative, and therefore we should not place it in a Jewish museum. As an educator, as a pedagogue, and I see this as my prime function here when I look at this, I see the only way to begin to get people to think is obviously to provoke, to get people to discuss these questions that I raised earlier. What is Jewish art? How do we evaluate Jewish art? Should there be something as Jewish art? Everything is open-ended. And I think the excitement can be for our children, for the individual to be able to respond visually, to use these visual images as a means to go deeper into issues that are critical for the development of Judaism and the Jewish culture.
What issue, for instance? Name the key issue that we can explore visually or through the visual arts.
I think that if we take this show, one of the things that's been happening, we see that the art, there's a tremendous amount of art that deals with the Holocaust in a variety of ways. I go back to that, perhaps that it's both the simplest and the most complex.
Okay.
We have with the second generation, a lot of people today now trying to come to terms with the Holocaust. What is happening, and I feel it's very important, this work is very important, however, we must begin to see in the burgeoning of art on the Holocaust that this cannot become the main aspect of Jewish identity, the negative. In other words, at a certain point as we rediscover the Holocaust, this becomes the aspect of Jewish identity, but there's more to it. And I think we see in these works of art that this is a beginning to deal with, and then we can go beyond.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for being here today.
Sim Shalom.